In this video, we'll be going over 10 abilities lost to time over the years of WoW's development, which will be making a return to the game once Classic is released, and which ones you should be looking forward to the most. And at number 10, we have a pretty easy one, and that's Eyes of the Beast for the Hunter class. Eyes of the Beast was a hunter ability that allowed you to take direct control over your hunter pet, and move around with it, attack with it, as well as use all of its abilities. So if you used a cat pet, for example, which had the stealth ability, hunters could legitimately scout out areas in stealth, before they got the camouflage ability. Eyes of the Beast was also helpful for the very niche hunter tank, where sometimes a hunter could use a pet to off-tank certain adds or bosses, but not very well. It was incredibly situational, a subpar way to tank, but with Eyes of the Beast, it allowed hunter pets to be positioned in exactly the place they needed to be, which helped with hunter tanking a lot. But there was no other huge benefits to having Eyes of the Beast, and that's why it was removed in Cataclysm to decrease ability bloat. But it was a very fun ability to use, and I'm happy to see its return. And funny enough, Blizzard said that having to recreate Eyes of the Beast for Classic WoW means they have all the work done in order to reintroduce the ability to live WoW, if they ever decide to do that. As previously, they said they lost the data on how the old Eyes of the Beast work, so they couldn't actually re-add it to the game without a huge amount of effort. And at number 9, we have Detect Magic for the Mage class. Now here's the thing you probably don't know about vanilla WoW. You can't actually see buffs on a target, only their debuffs. So a mage would have to use their Detect Magic ability in order to see which buffs the target had. And since nowadays you can see enemy buffs by default, this ability would literally be useless in modern WoW, and can only exist in the game in which stats are hidden. This is because, back in the day, information on mobs and enemy players used to be considered a valuable commodity, as some RPG games use the fact that the stats are hidden as part of balancing those games. But in the modern day, where people can look up all this information online, that kind of gameplay mechanic is rarely used, and is more left to tabletop RPGs. And that's why they removed this feature of the game very early in WoW's life, as it didn't really work very well in an MMO, a mechanic which will be returning to the game with Classic WoW, and hence Detect Magic as well. And at number 8, we have the Rogue Poison sub-profession. Did you know rogues had 2 extra professions? They had one for lockpicking, which they still kind of have today, and they had another for creating their poisons. Nowadays, only certain rogue specs even use poisons, and they're more buffs that you cast on the player than they are things you put on your weapons. But in vanilla WoW, you had to level up your poison profession to create the best possible poisons, which you could then apply on your weapons. And poisons applied to your weapons had a limited amount of charges to them, only lasted 30 minutes instead of an hour, didn't scale with your gear in any way, and would disappear if you entered a different zone, which meant you had to reapply them after every wipe. So it was possible for your weapons to run out of poisons mid-fight with the old mechanic as well. Luckily, Classic WoW will be running on the 1.12 client, and they fix poisons despawning from your weapons when changing zones in patch 1.11. So Classic WoW players will not have to deal with that. Now, in order to level up your poison profession, you would do it just like any other profession, and just make a ton of low-level poisons. And you can get the materials from vendors, lockboxes, pickpocketing, and herbs. So from rogue-related activities and herbalism. The poison sub-profession was removed from rogues in Wrath of the Lich King, so it only really existed for 2 expansions. And at number 7, we have the Shaman Sentry Totem. This is another fun ability like Eyes of the Beast that didn't really have too many battle-related benefits, so it was removed over the course of the game just to get rid of ability bloat. Now what Sentry Totem did was allow you to look through the eyes of the totem. So for example, if you set the Sentry Totem outside of a building, and then ran inside of that building, you could click on your Sentry Totem in order to look outside of that building. So it was kind of a scouting tool in certain circumstances. The most useful feature this totem had was scouting in battlegrounds, to see when enemy players were going to make a push into your base. And there was also a bug with it that would reset your character's fall distance if used in the air. So it could be used to prevent fall damage. This was not intended though, so I doubt Sentry Totem will do that in Classic WoW. And also its most useful feature that had nothing to do with combat or fall damage was its ability to allow you to take great screenshots of either your character or your guild's first boss kills. And at number 6, we have the Warlock's Detect Invisibility. This was a spell Warlocks had that they could use on themselves and friendly players, which would allow them to see invisible targets. Not stealth targets, mind you, only invisible targets, which basically just included invisible ghosts out in the world, like the ones in front of Undercity, and mages who use the invisibility spell. It also had niche uses to allow you to see invisible succubus pets or incredibly rare mobs or bosses that went invisible. That is to say, it didn't have very many uses and was an incredibly situationally useful spell, so it was more of a fun, flavorful ability. You may be noticing a pattern with all of these removed abilities. Most of them weren't super useful, and that's why a lot of them eventually got removed from the game. And with the removal of Detect Invisibility, players kind of lost the ability to see invisible stuff without special items for a long time. Until Blizzard added in some flavorful abilities through glyphs later on, and gave classes the ability to see invisible stuff, like with the Rogue's Swirly Ball Detection ability, for example. And at number 5, we have the human racial ability, Perception. Perception was a pretty weird racial ability that gave humans an increased chance to see stealth targets on an activatable ability that lasted for around 20 seconds. Now, being able to spot stealth rogues in PvP was a little bit easier back in the days when stealth was a lot worse than it is in live, and this racial ability allowed humans to see them even better. Now, unlike Detect Invisibility, this one specifically only worked on stealth targets, and does not in fact allow you to see invisible targets. Stealth and invisibility are two separate things in WoW. Now, what made Perception different from most other racial activatable abilities was this one gave you a pretty niche buff, whereas other ones would give you damage boosts, defensive abilities, or other combat related stuff. Perception was kind of an odd one out, and nowhere near as useful as something like Blood Fury or Stone Form, for example. So later on in WoW, Perception was turned into a passive ability and then removed from the game in Cataclysm. And at number 4, we have Scare Beast and Turn Undead. These are two fear abilities that only worked on two incredibly specific types of mobs. Hunters have Scare Beast, which was a castable CC with no cooldown, which could fear beasts for a pretty hefty amount of time. And the most useful application this ability had was in PvP against druids, who, while shapeshifted into some of their forms, were counted as beasts. And paladins with their Turn Undead could fear undead mobs, which were normally unfearable. Of course, later on in WoW, Turn Undead was turned into Turn Evil and worked on more targets than just undead. But both of these abilities no longer exist currently in WoW. But, funny enough, there are still incredibly specific CC abilities in the game. Druids have Hibernate, for example, which allows them to put beasts and dragon types to sleep. And priests have Shackle Undead, which allows them to incapacitate undead-only mobs. And these two abilities are incredibly similar to Scare Beast and Turn Undead. So it's a wonder why those two abilities aren't in the game anymore, while Hibernate and Shackle Undead are in the game. But whatever the case, they'll be making a return with Classic WoW. And at number 3, we have Mana Burn abilities, specifically Mana Burn, Viper Sting, and Drain Mana. In Cataclysm, Blizzard removed 2 of the 3 Mana Drain abilities, and then the final one with the start of Miss, because they didn't like the arena strategy of just trying to survive while you burned your opponent's healer's mana. Mana Burn was the Priest Mana Burn ability, which had a long cast time and would destroy 10% of your opponent's mana per cast, and then do damage based on the amount of mana you destroyed through the ability. So if you use Mana Burn 10 times, theoretically, that would be enough to completely wipe out someone's mana. In Vanilla WoW, before arenas were added to the game, Mana Burn abilities weren't really a big deal, as they only really applied in Battlegrounds, and in those kinds of settings, mana drains aren't the most important thing in the world for a variety of reasons that just don't apply to arenas. Especially since Mana Burn had such a long cast time, and could be interrupted by just about anything. Drain Mana was kind of in the same vein, except it was a channeled ability and would give the mana it stole to the Warlock, but could also be interrupted or stopped with any kind of CC, whereas Viper Sting was much different than the other two, as it was instant cast. You could just throw it up on a healer, and that would drain their mana over time. And if the healer didn't have the ability to dispel poisons, they couldn't get rid of it on themselves. And since Viper Sting was the easiest one to apply, it drained the least amount of mana out of all of them. And like I said a little earlier on in the video, mana drain abilities are only really a problem in arenas, which vanilla WoW won't have. So they shouldn't be as much of a nuisance as they were in the Burning Crusade or Wrath of the Lich King when they were in full force. And at number 2, we have the Warlock ability, Ritual of Doom. This is a very flavorful RP ability that Warlocks had, where they performed a ritual with 4 other party members in order to summon a Doom Guard. And when the Doom Guard is summoned, one of the 5 people who channeled the spell would be sacrificed in order to summon that Doom Guard, which could include the Warlock himself. And then once the Doom Guard was summoned, it was a neutral demon who would go around and start attacking people. So if you wanted it as a pet, you had to tame it with Enslaved Demon, which only allowed you to use the Doom Guard for 5 minutes, unless it broke the seal early. And while the Ritual of Doom was a very neat ability in theory, in practice and usefulness, it was just a tad bit too inconvenient to use in any practical manner. But you definitely could summon the Doom Guard and use it as a pet in raids. But it was also much easier to just use a regular Warlock pet instead, especially since Ritual of Doom also had a 1-hour cooldown. Ritual of Doom was removed from the game later on in WoW, and currently it is incredibly difficult to summon a Doom Guard, as they only randomly spawn if a random talent that only one spec of Warlocks can take is able to get the killing blow on a target. So it doesn't really exist in the game anymore, and especially not in the way it did in vanilla WoW, where you had to perform the ritual with 4 other people. And I think the Warlock Ritual of Doom is the perfect example of a vanilla WoW-like ability, where Blizzard was really experimenting with what they could do with the game, and trying to figure out what was cool and what was useful, and sometimes those two things didn't really mix. Or sometimes they were too useful and had to be removed because of that, like the number 1 spot on this list. And at number 1, we have the Paladin ability, Divine Intervention. On a 1-hour cooldown, the Paladin could kill themselves in order to place an unbreakable bubble on a party member, who would drop them out of combat and make them not be able to do anything until they clicked off the bubble. And it was supposed to fulfill the Paladin fantasy of sacrificing themselves in order to save someone, as it did this very well, and was mostly used in raids as a wipe recovery tool, where the Paladin can sacrifice themselves in order to save a healer who could start rezzing people, while at the same time saving them a repair bill. The problem with this ability though, is it was a little too good at saving people, and the bubble placed on people was a little too good at making them immune to everything and drop out of combat. Because you see, this ability would completely break some encounters, and people were using it in order to bug out boss fights to kill them easier, or to completely ignore tough phases of certain fights. It got to the point where Blizzard said they were designing fights with Divine Intervention in mind, as in, they constantly had to think, will this new mechanic be broken by a Divine Intervention? And if an ability is so powerful that Blizzard has to design fights around it, you know there's a problem with it, and that's why they just kind of removed it with the Cataclysm. Kind of the same reason why they removed the AoE silence from Blood Elf's Arcade Torrent racial. Blizzard doesn't like to design fights around one specific ability, but with Classic WoW, all of the boss fights have already been designed with Divine Intervention in mind, and there's a good probability that they would have fixed the few fights that Divine Intervention broke, like Razorgore and Blackwing Lair, and it's kind of one of those abilities that can only exist in Classic WoW, as there's no way it'll come back to live version of the game in its Classic WoW form. Alright, and that's the end of the video. Do you know of any other abilities coming back for Classic that should have made this list? Do you have any ideas for videos just like this one? If so, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.
This quest is impossible! How am I supposed to kill these squirrel boars? Every time I pull on several more patrol clothes and